to thank Dana for letting us use this space, and Sarah, it's a great space for us to use. And thank you to the committee, Joni and Dana and Christy, for all the work that you've done to help us support Sarah. It's quite a gift to be advising this committee, so I'm very lucky. And thank you to the whole community that's here supporting Sarah. A PhD takes a community, it's not just an individual thing, so thank you all. Just a bit about process. Sarah's going to present for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have a critical response process to get some feedback, and then we in the committee will go into that room over there and have some questions for Sarah. Yeah, and then you'll all hear how she did. So enjoy the food, she's going to talk about it, and thank you again all for being here.
Thank you, Scott. Thank you all so much for being here. I'm really grateful for every single one of you. I'm grateful to my committee for having taken me on this journey with you. I'm especially grateful to my family and my husband who's actually helped set up this food. And of course, we cannot forget the farmers, the growers who have made this food possible. And then we are on this land of indigenous people of O'odham. So let's not forget them as well in this process. So before I actually get into the nitty-gritty of my research, I wanted to present myself a little bit through this food that you have in front of you. So I'm Egyptian Italian, and food has always been a really central part of my upbringing, my life. Since a little kid with my grandmother, we would spend hours making pasta from scratch and feeding up to 15 people on a daily basis. And then later on in life, I started working with small-scale communities in Egypt, and really food was this way of producing positive change in our community. And then I joined Slow Food, and through that I also, managed to work across borders. So I was working in the North Africa region, and food was a way to bring very challenging countries together to actually communicate over things that we really love and appreciate. So in front of you, you have some Egyptian stuff. So there's tahina, there's tamia, which is our falafel. And the way we eat in Egypt is you share. You know, tear the bread together and you make a little scoop with it. We call it widn al-Otta, which is the ear of a kitten, because it looks like that. And the idea is to level the ground. We're all on the same stage when we're eating. But it's also nutritious food. We use a lot of leafy greens, and so antioxidants. There's whole wheat. So it's a really nutritious diet. And coming here, I was worried, coming from my PhD, I'm going to lose a little bit of this food. But little did I know that this is a land that actually has a very long agricultural history, very similar to Egypt. So a river that comes through, maybe we don't see it anymore, but it did support for centuries the O'odham, and before them the Hohokam with their canal systems that also very similar to Egypt. We have canal systems too, very that date back 3,000 to 4,000 years. And so in that, I wanted to try and honor this a little bit, and honor the indigenous people who are trying to support the foods that they are preserving. And so in honor of that, I wanted to honor the three sisters, which are the corn, the first sister, who then has the beans that crawl on top of her. The first one is the anchor, and the second one is fixing nitrogen, but is also using the other one as an anchor. And by the way, these beans that are in the salsa are tepary beans from a local farm here, Ramona Farm, who's trying to revitalize some of the indigenous food. And then covering the surface, you have the leaves of the squash that protect from dehydration. And so the sisters, work together in unison. So I wanted to honor that. You have that with your chips and the salsa. Now, in both of these locations, there are practices of good food, and not just these locations, other places around the world. And often, these practices of good food are ones that are held by women. There are small-scale practices of preservation, of improving nutritional value. And one of these is fermentation. And so to honor fermentation, I have made also some sourdough that takes a few days to prepare. So the bruschettas are all this companion relationship that I have built with my uh, bacteria, the lactobacillus bacteria, the Saccharomyces yeast, along with bringing in one of the indigenous grains here, which is the white sonora. So there's white sonora in this bread. And to give it a bit of sweetness, there's some mesquite, which is something my husband and I went and foraged for last summer. And so this is the flour from it. Now, on top of these bruschettas, you have tomato and basil, which happen to be this great companion species of plants in a garden. And you also have a goat cheese that has on top of it a bit of figs and some pomegranate molasses. And you know what? It actually happens to be a great agroforestry system that we have in the Middle East, which is fig trees and pomegranate trees and under them grazing goats that make this complete kind of nature-inspired system. So all these kind of practices, farming, ranching, all kinds of different food production are really very important to me, and I'm particularly interested in the ones that are happening in arid regions. I'm interested in seeing the recipes that are passed down from generation to generation, the practices that are passed down, the ones that are inspired from the natural world, but also reinvented, brought in a different way to make them applicable today, to make sense from an entrepreneurial point of view, and try to reach markets and be economically viable. So all of this is me trying to throw at you what I think is this regenerative food system, which is going to be the focus of my presentation today. And you guys can keep eating. Okay, so regenerative food system that honors small-scale producers' good food. Now, so in order to explain that, I need to first tell you what a food system is. So a food system, according to Erickson's kind of definition, is a series of different activities that take place. So they'd be, from a farm, production, processing, distribution, their cooking, and then management of waste. Now, some of them will be different according to the actual system, but it's a combination of some of these kind of steps. Now, there are different types of food systems. There are industrial ones, there's now sustainable ones, and I'm interested in the regenerative ones. So that's kind of where we're going. Now this is the flow of how this presentation is going to go. So I'm going to really go into some background, and then I'm going to present to you my guiding ethics, my research and methodology, go through deliverables and outcomes, and then Alyssa is going to take us through this process called critical response process. So starting in the early 1900s, you have a situation around the world of a growing population that is starving. And so different innovators, such as Burlock, for example, and Haber-Bosch, started coming up with solutions to try and produce more food. So Burlock, who's usually connected as the father of the Green Revolution, really started working on wheat intensification. The Haber-Bosch process produced synthetic fertilizers that really also increased production. And that, yes, meant we have a lot of grains, a lot of food production. We have supermarkets that are full to the brim with a variety of different products. We have standardization, codes to make sure that food is safe, so HACCP certification. And you also have genetically modified crops that are trying to resolve a certain issue, like, for example, making drought-tolerant crops. But these solutions what came with them was a whole bunch of other, maybe unintended consequences, maybe intended, but there were consequences, which are that you have, from an agriculture perspective, we've really eroded a lot of soils, we've polluted the waters, we've depleted the nutrients from the soil, but also from a farmer perspective, so small-scale farmers really got pushed out of the system because they cannot compete with this big industrial system, with these standards and with these codes. And the ones that were part of it, so the farmers that are part of the system, are often not paid well, not treated well. So it's a really rough system that's trying to just be efficient. This is obviously a broad generalization I'm making. There are the exceptions, but that's kind of the system that this exists in. And then with the genetically modified crops, you have scholars like Vandana Shiva who have been talking for decades now, saying that GMOs have directly affected the lives of Indian farmers and have been the cause of suicide rates in the past 2 decades alone, over 300,000 suicides of farmers. And so to resolve this problem, in the 80s a shift in paradigm started taking place, trying to resolve some of these issues, trying to not have these chemicals and pesticides, so pushing towards better farming practices, organic farming, and new types of certification, looking at fair trade, for example. However, from my point of view, this is just about doing less harm. There's still some critical issues that are not addressed. So small-scale producers are still not really part of this conversation. This is a picture of female farmers that I've worked with in Egypt, that their voices are not really part of the system in general, and they're definitely not part of the organic conversation because they cannot afford to have the size of lands and the requirements to have organic farming. So there is a growing alternative, and this is where I hope to focus the rest of my research, which is in a regenerative food system. Now, I have not found an actual definition of what regenerative food system is. There are definitions of regenerative agriculture specifically, but I'm talking about the system. So I put one together. This is a working definition and a really heavy one, so it will change. But for now, it's a whole systems approach to food that is about being place-based, integrating agroecological practices with nature-inspired solutions while being engaged civically and economically. So it's a system that produces delicious and culturally appropriate food that is ecologically net positive while trying to achieve social justice and intergenerational and interspecies equity. As I said, very big definition, and I'm bringing this in from a lot of different scholars. But I wanted to just try and show you how I use this a little bit, or how I think of it. So for example, if we were to take a practice that is found within small-scale communities like foraging. Foraging is something that a lot of indigenous communities do, and often is being seen as, well, this is not a sustainable practice because if we can all went out and forage, then we're going to get rid of all the foraged produce. True, but if we think of it in this system, which is a whole systems approach that is place-based, so it is about being in this place because it actually impacts the people of this place, while we're integrating agroecological practices. So it's not just a matter of just going out and foraging, but we're bringing in other practices like maybe reseeding or some permaculture practices of building earthworks that will ensure that new shrubs come forward. So I've taken something, but I've replenished it. Coupled with really a deeper understanding of some of the sociocultural aspects, so there might be rituals that are associated with it, there might be ceremonies or something like that. And all of this could be really nice, but if it comes at the expense of the next generation, then it's not a good practice, it doesn't work. If it comes at the expense of the equity of other species, the pollinators that are coming through to get, that pass through, like the bats that pollinate the saguaros, for example, if it's at their expense, then this doesn't make sense. So this is kind of how I'm using the definition to also assess whether the practices are regenerative or not. Now this is big, food system, right? So I needed to bring it down and scale it down a little bit. It's still not enough. You see Joni smiling. So this is my selection criteria. This is how I'm trying to bring it in. I have a scale I'm looking at, which is small scale, and I'll tell you in a second why I chose that. And this was hard to define because it's a different definition in different countries. But 10 acres or less. If I'm talking about ranching, it's 100 heads or less. In the actual production, it's cottage industries, which are usually defined by state here in the United States. The practices are regenerative in terms of that they are improving the soil, they are adding to the biodiversity. I'm looking specifically at artisanal indigenous practices, and I'm focusing in on arid regions. And in the next few slides, I'm going to try and explain, why I'm kind of doing that. So small scale, for one, other than the United States, 60% of the food produced in the world is actually produced from small scale farms. And in that case, they're actually usually 5 acres or less pieces of land. And they're usually female farmers or female producers that are doing it. And they don't often have a seat at the table. And so part of my research is to look at how they can have a seat at the table, or have at least the voice be heard. So this on the left is Roxanne, who is an indigenous Pueblo, New Mexico, and she has been growing this land in a permaculture style which integrates indigenous practices along with what is learned in a permaculture course. But what she's also done is a really cool experiment with her family, extended family and friends, which they've called the Pueblo Food Experience. And the idea behind that was to try and see what it would look like if they went to what they're calling pre-contact foods, so the foods before colonialization came in, and what would that have an impact on their life and on their diet? And it did. I mean, there's a whole literature that they've published. She has also a book on it. But it's interesting because it's like another way of looking at food. It's like one that is more adapted to their life. On the right is chef and academic and wonderful person called Lois Ellen Frank, who is who's been making the case for the past 15 years that there is such a thing as an indigenous cuisine, like there's an Italian or a French one, there's an indigenous American one. This is her as I'm interviewing her. She can help herself but feed me. Great. This is a corn soup with both Hopi corn and blue corn biscuits. Super delicious. And so the small scale producers, one of the other challenges that exist is that they usually sit outside of these regulatory frameworks. So this on the left is Mara King, who does fermented foods like kimchi, for example. And when she first started, and for a very long period of time, her foods were all sold under the table, like they say. She couldn't sell commercially because fermented foods, which have microbes in them growing, are a challenge in the regulatory system. You need to have large industrial scale kitchens to be able to produce the stuff, even though some of the health benefits can be really high. On the right is some research that I also conducted over the summer. There's quite a big Nepali community here in Phoenix, and this here is someone making something called gundrup, which is fermented leafy greens. Super yummy. But again, they couldn't sell because this is like not the kind of specs that the industrial system has set as standards. So there must be another way of thinking about that. At least that's how I think. Oh my God. Okay. Regenerative. So the second thing is that it has to have like regenerative farming practices. On the left side is a picture from a couple's place in Snowflake, Arizona, who have been working over the past few years, bringing in mycelia and bacteria as a way of regenerating their soils. They had these super harsh clay soils that within a couple of years have grown wonderfully lush foods. On the right side is practices of bringing in some perennial crops along with your staples, so that allows the soil to really grow its roots and have a foundation that doesn't deplete it as much. So these are just a couple of the practices. And I'm focusing on arid regions, and the reason is a few reasons. So first of all, about 41% of the landmass that we have on Earth is actually arid. It's about 2 billion people living in arid regions. Secondly, given climatic changes, arid regions will be a good place to kind of see what good practices are to be exported, because we're talking about a potential of having high temperatures, decreased water, depleted soil, so they are a good representation of what you can do in other places. And this is not something that I'm making up. A paper was published in 2019 by Handula et al. Here at ASU that is making the case for southwestern cities as being a good testing ground for climatic changes that will take place in the future or are taking place in other cities across the world. And last thing that I'm going to be working on is I come from Egypt, North Africa. I come with a lot of practices and having worked with small-scale producers, and I'm here in the US and learning about also these kind of practices here, and I hope that this work continues to be a cross-pollination of some sort. So I hope to be, if I graduate, a professor of practice. Hint, hint. Professor of practice, which will mean that I will hope to have a foot within academia and one outside. And so I want to make sure that I'm also getting this kind of knowledge that I can continue to cross-pollinate between different areas. So this takes me to my guiding ethics, and so within some of the literature that I'm inspired from, so feminist scholarship, arts-based ones, it's always important to define what your ethics are, and so I will do that in a second. But before that, I've also been inspired by certain guides that have been an inspiration of how I think, and I'm framing some of my thoughts moving forward. So one is Robin Wall Kimmerer, who is both a botanist, she's an indigenous woman, but she's a botanist, and she's also like thinks of plants from a cultural and spiritual perspective. So this is a quote that I really like. If we're to look for models of self-sustaining communities, we need look no further than an old growth forest. So looking at nature, at that established ecosystem as a space of getting inspiration, but also, or the old growth cultures they raised in symbiosis with them. The people who have existed, the traditions that have learned to co-evolve. So these are two spaces that I'm heavily influenced in my research. The nature, biomimicry, this is why you're here, at the Biomimicry Center. And two is traditional practices, indigenous practices, but not only indigenous, other small-scale practices that have been passed down, so it doesn't have to just be indigenous. Another person that I'm influenced by is Jessica Hayes Conroy, and I always get confused because she has a twin, and they both work in the same field, and so I don't know if I'm really inspired by her or her sister, but anyway, nutrition becomes a sort of colonial practice whereby those in the know seek to teach others how to conform to appropriate forms of citizenship. And this really is a reminder to myself of my own subjectivities. So in my previous work, I've worked with small-scale producers, and I have often brought in my own worldview and narrative in what nutritional food should look like. And that's a colonial practice in and of itself. And so this is a reminder to myself as I'm doing this work to be cognizant of that. And it's also a reminder to all of us who are working in sustainability, where we do put forward normative values like, there's a big push right now to a vegetarian diet and a vegan diet, and it's probably good for the United States because the US probably should eat less meat. However, it comes with consequences that we need to be aware of. So for example, a country like Kenya, where avocados are being exported around the world, this has meant that Kenya now doesn't have a population that can afford avocados because they're going to developed world, or whatever you want to call it, first world. There's also other things like, yes, we're right now, trying to push away from meat, so we're doing meatless burgers, but these are highly processed foods that are still part of this larger industrialized kind of food system. So this is a reminder to myself and to other sustainability students to be aware of what our unintended consequences could be, and not to put the strain on the small-scale producers who have ultimately been feeding us for the past life, basically. Now, going back to this idea of guiding ethics, so these are the top 3 that I've articulated for myself. So I want to, as I move forward in my research, really have a positive development framework, which is about looking at the solutions and the positive things. We tend to find ourselves a lot of times talking about the gloom and doom and negativity. I'm not going to be in that space. I'm going to be in a space of positivity. I'm very influenced by ecofeminist approach, which has a lot of different nuances that I won't get into in today's presentation, but one of the big things is this idea of, you know, separation between sexes or races is because there's this kind of oppressive system that exists, and that same relationship is the same one that we have towards nature, that oppressive kind of man over nature, human over nature kind of attitude. And so really trying to deconstruct what that looks like, but also understanding that we have multiple ways of knowing, that there's embodied knowledge. It's not all just head, but there's knowledge that you can gain from the heart, from feelings, from engaging your actual, all your senses. And also, very important is this acknowledgement that there's multi-species. We're not just human beings on this earth. There's other organisms that we need to pay attention to, but also that we can learn from. They can be our mentors, they can be our teachers, by looking at their strategies, so looking at it from a biomimetic point of view. And lastly, ensuring that my practice is reciprocal. So as a researcher, I don't want to be extractive, I don't want to take just knowledge, I want to figure out a way of how I can give back. That could be in terms of time or in terms of skill set. Depends on the person that I am doing research with. So this is kind of the background. Now I'm really going to get into the nitty-gritty of the research and objectives. So this is what I hope to do. So my objectives is to develop a working definition and a framework for a regenerative food system that is inspired by small-scale producers' concepts of good food. I want to identify what these characteristics look like and the practices are. I want to identify potential tools for more inclusive food governance. And lastly, I want to develop outputs that cross-pollinate knowledge between these different arid regions. So, to do that, these are my research questions. The first one is like an overarching one that I then break down. So what is good food, how is it produced, and by who, and what are the tools necessary to cross-pollinate this knowledge? The first question that breaks that down a little bit more is, what are the characteristics of good food in arid regions, and what are the most appropriate theoretical frameworks to understand good food systems? 2, given climatic changes, how is good food produced, evolved, and scaled in a modern, inclusive, and regulated system, and by whom? And 3, how can creative arts-based tools be used to cross-pollinate good food wisdom? Don't have to remember these. I'm going to have them as I explain the next section, which are my methods. So, given the interdisciplinary nature of the work that I'm doing, it's in sustainability science and food studies, I have been inspired from many different methods. It mainly falls under social science methods, so qualitative methods, but I am heavily inspired by feminist methods. And these methods here are not purely feminist. They obviously come from other places, but these are ones that they often use in feminist research. So open-ended interviews, participant observation, grounded theory, and autoethnography. And then from the arts, games, arts activities, and filming. And as I talk about my different research questions, I'm just going to tell you the different methods. I'm not going to go in and tell you this is feminist, this is arts. It's just a mix of all of them together. So, question number 1. Again, characteristics of good food in arid region and theoretical frameworks. So, this is kind of the foundation of my work. And this is a complex part because I'm using grounded theory, which is often a very long process that takes decades. You know, this might be my work for my whole life, and it's an iterative process, but I'm beginning with a grounded theory, which takes from the literature, and it also takes from the interviews with people that I've interviewed, and from that come up with thematics that make up this framework that I'm trying to put together. So I'll go into each one separately. So my literature review was from both the academic and grey literature. So, for example, grey literature included websites such as the Savory Institute, the Land Institute that are working on regeneration. The keywords that I was using were regenerative, dryland farming, permaculture, and this is not written here, but and others. And then the idea was that I extrapolated the recurring principles and put them on these tables. And then I went into the field. I was lucky enough to get a grant last summer from Neely that allowed me to interview people in the Southwest. And from that, I started doing open-ended questions. I started recording my observations, and I went through an inductive process, which was transcribing this material and then coding it and coming up with themes that I started, matching up with the first one. But I'll talk about that in a little bit in more detail in a second. So if you remember, I said that I wanted to hone in and have a selection criteria. I'm using that throughout my process. So in selecting my interviews, again, the scale is the same one, small scale. The climate that I'm focusing on more specifically is latitudes of between 15 and 35. So places with low rainfall, 10 inches or below, with sparse vegetation and high ultraviolet exposure. The system that I'm focusing on is regenerative one, with the definition coming from the Rodale Institute, where you're looking at increasing biodiversity, encouraging perennial variety, and practices that improve the soil. And then the people I'm focusing on are artisanal, traditional practices that follow agroecological kind of process or have some kind of skillfulness within that. This is what I've done so far in terms of interviews and the locations that I've done them in. And then the challenge is like trying to then map this all up together. So what initially came up was this kind of looked like a framework that was similar to regenerative development, which is an existing framework. So that was my first process. But then when I started looking deeper, actually looked at two things that have influenced my thinking, which are nature-inspired kind of solutions. So there are practices that are looking at nature for inspiration, and practices that are looking at traditional kind of ecological knowledge. So this became the two frameworks that I'm now inspired to work on, and I'm still at the beginning of this, so bear with me for the next section because it's not fine-tuned yet, but it will get there. But the idea is I brought in traditional ecological knowledge, which is a defined field by different scholars like Burke, Skinner, Nelson, and Schilling, and got the principles that are there, and then Life's principles, which are principles that were actually developed by Dana and a team of people that are ubiquitous characteristics of the natural world. So there are a set of principles like, for example, being resource and energy efficient or adapting to changing conditions. And then using these to try and figure out where would these regenerative practices fit in. And this again is my working framework. It's supposed to represent the ripple in the stream of water or something. And I started aligning the principles of TEK with LP, with Life's principles, to see which ones matched. And these principles, these are not all, for example, the Life's principles, these are not all the TEK principles, but these are the ones that I extrapolated from both the literature and my interviews as being the kind of dominant ones. And from there, the idea is to start matching up what are the actual practices. So for example, honorable harvest is similar to resource and energy efficiency and the concept of harvesting what you need. So Robin Wall Kimmerer talks about honorable harvest as this process of whenever you go out to forage or to harvest crops, that you should be first asking permission and listening to the answer of that. Evaluate what your impact could be, take only what you need, and then demonstrate respect and reciprocate with a gift. And that can mean a whole slew of different things, but just having that kind of concept is one of the examples that would fit in there. Research question 2. Given climatic changes, how is good food produced, evolved, and scaled in a modern and inclusive and regulated system, and by whom? Again, 3 methods here: a literature review, interviews, and the interviews are the same interviewees that I did before, but I had separate questions that were for this research question. And then from that, 4 to 5 in-depth interviews, and this is something that is still going to happen. So the literature review was academic and gray literature, focused on Arizona's cottage industry. Keywords that I used were combination of food and fermentation or ethnic and traditional. And then there again, I'm looking at recurring principles that come out. My interviews were, as I said, same, but the difference is in the transcription. I was identifying concepts of good food and what are the different tools that enable that. And then the next step is then to select 4 to 5 projects where I will conduct more in-depth observations. I'm doing what is called participatory rapid assessment. So they're not participatory observation because the literature says that requires months of work, and I'm planning to only be there for 5 to 10 days. And in that space, I'll be using arts-based methods. Again, I have criteria for that the practices are feasible in developing worlds and scalable, because that's what I'm trying to figure out. They can be applied in arid as well as hyper-arid regions. They also improve on ecosystem services, and that it doesn't require big changes in regulation. These are some examples of my tools. This is not all, but side by side in the field, this is the concept of being in the field, working with the person, and that could be in a kitchen or on the farm, and I have my recorder, and as we're working, I'm asking my questions. Just a way of getting knowledge that is more embodied, because you're actually doing it as you're in it, using some games like improvisation games, again to try and get into that deeper nuanced knowledge, as well as some drawings and things like that. That's question 2. Question 3, how can creative arts-based tools be used to cross-pollinate more nuanced understanding of good food wisdom in arid regions? Three methods also, 3 to 4 videos, 2 workshops in Egypt, and an autoethnography, and I'll talk about each one in detail. So last semester I had the chance to take a class with Peter Bick, which really taught me about documentary filmmaking, and so I'm hoping to use documentary style in my capturing of the different practices. They're not going to be very long ones. The idea is to highlight practices that exemplify regenerative food systems. Just like at the top of my head, I still don't know what they are, but it could be like, I could be looking at some kind of dryland farming practice, waffle gardens, for example, or some kind of a fermentation process, with the idea of that being knowledge that I can use for cross-pollination. And this is how I'm selecting the videos. Duration of 5 to 10 minutes, that they're applied also to arid regions, in the scale, that they're something that doesn't require me months of filming, because I'm only there for a period of time, that they're innovative practices and enrich biodiversity, and that they're appropriate in a socially conservative community, given that I'm hoping to use some of the stuff in Egypt, and also that the artisan or the person themselves is willing to share this knowledge. Sometimes this is proprietary kind of knowledge. And so the idea is these videos are filmed. I then go to Egypt, collaboration with an organization that I've co-founded, actually, Nawaya, do 2 workshops in a rural and a peri-urban context, and use these videos and see what the feedback is from reflections, what people think about that. And then that all goes into this autoethnographic chapter that I hope to do. So as I said earlier, I hope to be a professor of practice, but I'm in this field of sustainability, and I need to be acknowledging my objectivity and so forth. And so the idea of this process is to try and figure out how much of my voice comes through, how much do I kind of influence that to assess that in my future going forward. As I'm filming, I'm making editorial choices, that makes a difference. So kind of assessing that process. And I've been keeping a weekly journal since the beginning of coming to the US. I've compiled pictures, I have videos and editing choices that I'll be looking at, as well as the reflections from the workshop. So this is just like a summary of this whole thing. So research question 1, 2, and 3. I'm pretty much done with this top one. It's not really yet published, but I'm pretty much done with this. I'm done with these 2, so I'm halfway kind of through my research so far. And I'm sorry I'm giving you guys my back. I don't know how to. So my deliverables and outcomes, almost done. So first deliverable is for my first question is having a framework that really explains regenerative food system and a published manuscript. For research question 2, a set of tools of inclusive food governance as well as published manuscript, so 2 manuscripts. And then research question 3 to 4 short documentaries on food practices, hopefully published in some kind of open source platform, 2 workshops in Egypt and an autoethnographic chapter. And finally, these are the expected outcomes that I hope to achieve. So diverse meanings and definitions of good food, generalizable characteristics on this regenerative food system that take inspiration from these 2 frameworks, transferable knowledge, something that I can take to the different places, and identification of tools that are inclusive for diverse food culture. And then, this is my timeline. I hope to do all of this in a year and a half. I think I can do it. And I wanted to end with, this is kind of what I see this work and my work going forward. I hope to continue creating these pathways for cross-pollination between small-scale producers in arid regions and explore mechanisms that honor small-scale producers' voices and strategies, and hope to continue to be actively contributing to this process. And then I need to invite Alyssa. So, this is it. I'm done. So Alyssa is a Master's of Fine Arts student. Well, graduated actually. Just recently. And what we're going to be doing is using a process called critical response process that was developed by Liz Lerman, who's a professor here at ASU. It's a several-step process, so it's not just going to be questions. She's going to guide it, and I will find a chair.
Yeah, and come join me up here, and I'll kind of introduce y'all to the process as we're finding. Sorry, you can take this one.
No, I'll grab that one.
Okay. So, so the critical response process is a really fun opportunity to get some really good focused feedback that is centered on what's really going to help Sarah get to her next stage of development. Because as you could tell in her presentation, she's done a lot of the research so far. So at this point, it's really what is going to help Sarah get to the development and the enacting part of her research. You're good. So with that, Liz Lerman is a dancer and a researcher in a wonderful myriad of things. And so she was finding that feedback tends to not be centered on who's receiving the feedback. So this process is a really great opening to recentering that. So with that, the goals of today that Sarah and I discussed is Sarah is looking for feedback, this was the gesture she used, that is from a systems perspective. So we have about 15 minutes to give some wonderful systems perspective feedback. And the hope is that we're not giving very detail oriented, that is not systems perspective feedback. Is that kind of what we identified? Great. So I'm here, my role, there's 3 roles in this process. I'm the facilitator, so I'm here to hold space. So I'm here to keep us on time, I'm here to move the process forward, and I'm here for Sarah's agency, and that we stay focused on what Sarah is wanting us to focus on. Then there's the role of the responders, and your role is to just stick with me and stick with Sarah through this process. I'm going to feed it to you as we go. So everybody take a deep breath in, and a deep breath out. And just stick with me and be open to this new kind of way of giving feedback. And then there is also the role of the presenter, which is Sarah, and so Sarah has a step in this process as well. So step 1 is what you noticed. So we tend to, in feedback, when we give I noticed statements, we say I like or I didn't like. So in this, I'm going to give us the prompt of just kind of blurt out, and let's go around, not in any particular order, and just say I noticed, and then fill in the blank.
I noticed that you're very passionate about your topic.
Passion.
I noticed that great organization. I love the powerful they
I'm going in the right.
Yeah, you definitely
I
are.
noticed that Sarah was really organized.
Yes. What else did we notice?
I noticed a sense of incredible focusing that was missing earlier in the process. In other words, when she came here, early in the process, she was really sort of general and all over the place in the literature review. And now I noticed the way that you have narrowed it down is amazing and really well thought out.
So you noticed specificity. Anything else we noticed?
I noticed that all of us as a community here, it's a lot.
I noticed a lot of respect for a lot of different stakeholders.
I noticed that this is a research not only about academia but about yourself.
I noticed a really high attention to the choice of words that were very deliberate and meaningful and honoring, simultaneously very academic but also very accessible. It was very well crafted. There wasn't any sloppiness in the language.
I noticed inclusivity. Many people, many cultures, and what we can share.
That's really great.
I noticed the basically attention to not repeat the mistakes of the Western colonial extractive academic system.
I noticed the use of very delicious food and the storytelling around each of the strategic choices of what was put before us.
Let's do another like 2-3 more and leave space for that. And if it's silent, it's silent.
It was very meaningful to me that relationships, especially through the use of the images that he had, is like a powerful part of you as a researcher, and identity as a researcher. It's clear to me that relationships is a really integral part of this project.
I noticed the tension between the drive to do creative, constructive building, coupled with the call to do critical, extractive research.
I noticed the passion to take back practices and what is working and develop forward to where she comes from.
Thank you, everybody. That was really helpful, and I appreciate you really living into the I noticed statements. I think that got us on a good speed. So let's keep that up, and also thank you for the really intentional words that you're doing. Okay, so this next part of the process, this is step 2. Again, there's 4. This is for Sarah to ask her questions that she has prepared. So we're going to start with 1, and if we can get to 2, great. What I ask is, my role here is to make sure that we are all focusing on the specific question that Sarah is asking. So be mindful to listen to this question and to stay focused on this topic.
Thank you. So I'm curious to know whether from your experience or from the research you've done that you think there might have been methods that could have been useful for my research question that I maybe didn't tackle that could be good for me. So I'm really asking the more academic hat-ons right now. Very specific question. So you know.
I'm sure familiar that there are these indigenous research methods, and we can talk about this more.
Do you have something specific that you were thinking that you felt could have been addressed?
It's just the way you work in this community. It could be enriching your approach because there is also indigenous research framework. It could be also, kind of finding the points of connection. Yeah, I cannot particularly point you to something.
But this is good to give like bullet points because this opens up opportunities for further conversations too. So thank you.
Yeah, I noticed that there's a lot about like learning information and then moving it to other groups and sharing that, and you're always the focal point of that. And so I wonder if there's an opportunity for like a co-production or some way of bringing people together to produce some of these outcomes.
I also noticed the bringing of many disciplines as well as many cultures, which could bring about a challenge about language and terminology. And I'm wondering if there is an opportunity for a phenomenology to help you bucket some of those ideas and develop an own language that will support across the cultures and the systems that we're working with.
That's why I use films, like, cause I was thinking of, you know, what can express something without needing words, you know?
Yeah.
I have a video here of an attempted kind of thing to show that, and it has no words in it, but it doesn't really work. So I mean, I'm still at that stage of developing it, but yeah, but it's exactly going at what you're saying, which is like trying to find something that can translate.
And make it shareable, because once it comes into the academic arena to other people to build on, if you don't have a terminology for it, then it's not going to be shared as much.
I just barely noticed the tension between your preferred mechanism of communication and the mechanism of communication that you are primarily relying on as your proposed outcome, and invite you to consider how can taste and smell enter back into that.
Maybe one more response we have time for, and then we'll move to the next phase.
I think you're already doing this, but drawing from like decolonizing methodologies, which a core principle, as you had mentioned, I think like the feminist methodologies, but it's also part of decolonizing methodology, not to be extractive. How do you give back, and moving away from like generalizations and making things culturally specific?
So this is hard because, and I'm answering back because I'm trying to get characteristics that are generalizable. So I don't know if you have any insights on how I can do both.
Let me get back there.
Yes, one more.
This is just a general sort of observation about some of your sources on multi-species relationship, and some of the things that you talked about in the presentation, specifically fermentation. So I'm wondering if there's ways in which you can make what you're doing with multi-species relationship more apparent. Just, for example, when you're talking about fermentation, you did that a little bit, but I think that maybe you could draw that out more, just to sort of make it really, really clear that you're talking, that regenerative anything requires multi-species relationship, and so in certain practices, including fermentation, you really see those kind of interactions that are sort of defined by your literature as multi-species relationship. So just bringing the multi-species relationship out a little bit more.
So due to time, we're going to go ahead and move on to step 3. So this is kind of where we as a room are going to shift, and we're going to be asking questions. But when we ask questions, we're going to phrase them in a neutral way. So I've given us a quick prompt that we can do. That way it's really easy to learn. And just say, I'm curious about something very specific. Insert right there. So this is a precursor to step 4, which is permissioned opinions, which we'll get into the rules later. But if you have an opinion that's kind of been itching in the back of your mind, step 3 is a really great way to kind of invert that opinion and go, what can I understand more about what Sarah's already done before I give an opinion? So this is a great time to kind of take that opinion, switch it, make it neutral, and a great way to make it neutral is just offering, I'm curious about, and then get as specific as possible. That way, Sarah knows how to respond. So I do want to say one thing right here is, since we have about 4 minutes left, we're going to let everybody kind of do it how we did in I Noticed. So go around, and then you can choose maybe 1 or 2 to respond to if you're interested.
I'm curious about the role nutrition is playing in the overall project, given the awesome quote from the Hayes Conroy twins about it potentially being a colonial practice.
Sarah, I am curious about whether or not you experienced your desire to create generalizable and specific knowledge as a tension or not.
I'm curious about cross-pollination, not necessarily between Arizona and Egypt, but between Arizona and the rest of Arizona, like in terms of increasing practice more widely locally.
Can I answer these?
Yeah, you can answer them whenever you're wanting to answer.
So, I've been grappling with nutrition for a very long time, and I'm glad you asked that, because of my previous practice, and because I acknowledge certain subjectivities in the way I did it, and I kind of pushed it aside because I'm uncomfortable with it. But it makes sense because it's a very important aspect of food sovereignty and food security. It is a really crucial part, and so it needs to be there. I just don't know how to do it at this point. So that's one. The desire to if there's a tension. I generally am a generalist, so I like being in that space. But the tension I find is that I'm here in academia doing a PhD, which is sort of tiny little thing. So I guess there is a tension, but it's because of the outside world rather than me. I'm fine with the general space. And then I have been thinking about that, and it all depends on the opportunities that exist. So I don't know what my future is going to bring me, but I've been in conversations with other professors here about creating an open source platform that could be part of some other programs. So for example, here at ASU, there's a program called PREPT that works with female food entrepreneurs. So there was an idea that maybe this could be something that complements their work, for example, but it's all conversations, nothing for sure. Yes.
Yeah, maybe one or two more, and then if you want to answer one more, we'll have time for that.
I am curious about how you plan to finance this whole process, because it seems like a very intense research.
Can I show a picture? Yeah. I don't know how to present it, but I do have a plan. Right? It's not just happening. So until this thing decides to wake up, I don't know if I touch space.
Yeah.
I mean, here it is. Here's my budget. So my budget's big, as you can see, 14,500. But some of it has already been covered. So I've already gotten Neely grant for 2,000. This was cumulative. This is like all my budget to do the whole research. I've already gotten about $1,000 from the Sweetie grant because we were working on a project together. I have a new grant for 3,000, and then I have some transcription software money that comes out of this. I have applied to 2 other grants, and I'm waiting for answers, one of which would really resolve the problem, as you can see. But a lot of it is also about being quite frugal with things. So I do need money to buy equipment, but I can also rent equipment. ASU has resources to do that. There's money budgeted in there for travel and accommodation, but I could just, work exchange or something like that. So there are ways around it. This is the ideal, basically. This is to live comfortably and be okay.
And to eat.
So we are at 1, so I know there's more questions, but if you have them, Sarah and I can kind of discuss at the very end, and if you're interested in receiving more questions, you can invite people to send those questions to you via email. Is that something you're interested in?
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, so if you have questions you didn't get to ask, you can put that in an email and send that to Sarah. Make sure you get her contact information if you have it. Okay, so we're going to do the last step real fast. The focus was more so on this step. So in other iterations of CRP, you really tailor it to the time you have and the person and what they're interested in. So this one we're going to do a quick version of as well. Step 4 is permissioned opinions. So it's also kind of very prompt based. So you would say, I have an opinion about, and then the specific thing you have an opinion about. Would you like to hear it? And Sarah gets to say yes or no, without any explanation as to why. It doesn't mean that there's a beef or anything, but could simply be that's not a phase that currently is relevant right now in SARS research. So I think we have time for about 2 to 3 if we do them fast.
I am not sure if this qualifies, but I was.
I'm here for reframing help.
But I was thinking, I was wondering, and also have a suggestion on your last deliverable, the outdoor ethnography. I wanted to see.
This is perfect. So this is another thing. So we could do here, I have a suggestion about, and then you can say what it is, and then she can say yes or no.
Okay. Yeah, so my suggestion is to be more specific about
Yeah.
your outdoor ethnographic work. In which vein are you going to be performing this? Are you working on an evocative outdoor ethnography or an analytical outdoor ethnography?
And you can say yes or no to this one.
Yeah, so yes, I'll answer that. I guess I didn't talk about it, but it was written, it's a layered autoethnography, which is one where you're reflecting alongside your data. That's basically so. I'm also taking my qualitative class this semester for the first time. This is me making it up.
Matt.
I have an opinion about who gets to see the videos that you create. Do you want to hear it?
Yeah.
Okay. I think that as an educator, I would want to be able to use that in teaching and in like workshop settings, and that makes me think about what might come with the video alongside it as somebody who use it in instruction.
Like a lesson plan?
Perhaps.
Okay. Y'all are getting this so fast. I think we have one more, yeah.
I have a suggestion for further growth and mixing in the nutrition that you were saying.
And then let's ask, would you like to hear it?
Yes. Would you like to hear it?
Sorry.
No, it's good. The area of functional medicine is growing really fast. And I'm wondering if there's potential for your research later to be dispersed faster if you had elements to functional medicine that come along with the idea of good food. What is good food and what does it do to our bodies? Not as a core, of course, but that might be a link.
I like that.
Okay, so thank you for going on this journey. It was a fast one, and I hope you get more opportunities to do CRP, where it's a little bit longer, but thank you. I really hope this was helpful. The last thing I want to do, this is kind of like an optional step 4+ or 5, whatever you want to do, is really ask Sarah the point of this whole thing, which is, what are you most excited to get back into the library and study? Where'd you?
What am I most, actually, what you just said right now, I'm definitely gonna go and do that research tonight. I didn't think about it, I really like that. Thanks.
Again, thank you so much for inviting me to the space. It was great.
Thank
And
you.
thank you, Sarah, for your wonderful presentation.
I don't know, you guys need to finish the food.
We've mentioned